Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Quinn, Director of Wilfrid Laurier University Press. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of Catastrophe, Stories and Lessons from the Halifax Explosion. As we gather here virtually, I want to acknowledge that my home and the press offices are located on the traditional territory of the Attawaddaron, or Neutral Peoples, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee on the Haldimand Tract, which runs 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. We express our gratitude to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. We are pleased to be launching this book as we collectively remember the anniversary of the explosion on December 6th. Catastrophe has truly been a collaborative project. Authored by the late T. Joseph Scanlon, the manuscript was edited with an introduction contributed by Professor Roger Sarty and came to the press through Mike Bechtold, both of whom are joining us today. I will leave the telling of this book's unusual journey to publication and its lessons of the explosions to their own words. A few housekeeping items before I hand over to Mike and Roger. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A. We will do our best to address any technical issues as they arise, and at the end of the session, select questions for Mike and Roger to answer. Links to purchase the ebook version of Catastrophe can be found in the chat, and we encourage you to order print copies from your favorite local bookseller. Print copies are also available directly from the press website with free shipping in Canada. There will be a code in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce Mike Bechtold, who will be leading today's conversation. Mike is an instructor in the Laurier Department of History, specializing in military history, and is the author or editor of numerous books and articles. His most recent book is Flying to Victory, Raymond Collishaw and the Western Desert Campaign, published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2017. Mike is a fellow of the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society at UNB and the Nipissing University Center for the Study of War, Atrocity, and Genocide, and has recently served as the executive director of the Juno Beach Center Association. Welcome, and over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Lisa, for that very kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight with everybody out there in the cyber world to talk about Catastrophe, a wonderful new book on the Halifax explosion. And here we are just 3 days before the 103rd anniversary of that terrible event. And I think it's very appropriate that we spend a little bit of time thinking about all those victims, all those people that had their lives shattered, lives destroyed, lives upended by this explosion that was one of the biggest man-made explosions in history. And it wasn't until the atomic bombings of the Second World War that there was a bigger explosion. So tonight it's my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Roger Sarty from the History Department at Wilfrid Laurier University, who has taken on this project. And Roger is a wonderful historian and an even better person. Been pleased to call him for a friend for quite a long time. Roger comes to us from quite a strong historical background. He spent time as a historian and then senior historian with the Department of National Defense in Ottawa. He was a key member of the official history teams that put together the official history of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And then he was the lead on the production of the books for the official history of the Royal Canadian Navy. After that, he went on to the Canadian War Museum and joined it with Jack Granatstein at the time that it was building a brand new museum. And he was the director of research and the exhibitions director at that time. And in 2004, he left the War Museum and came to Laurier. And while he's been at Laurier, he's been a teacher, an instructor, an advisor. He's been the editor of Canadian Military History, and I worked quite closely with him for about 15 years on that. And I have to say, I've never met a better historical editor in my career. Roger has a way of cutting through what people write and figuring out what they actually mean to say. And he was the absolute perfect person to come on board with this project about the Halifax explosion. When I worked at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, I was first approached by Brenda Murphy, who teaches down at Laurier Brantford, and she sent me an email out of the blue and said, hello, Michael, I'm not sure if you're the right person, but I have this wonderful manuscript. Unfortunately, the author has passed away, but we're still looking to get it published. Is there anything you think you can do about this? And that was in February 2017. And of course, there was something we could do. And while I was at the press, we worked to get it together. And then we brought Roger on board to get it done. And he's really taken it across the goal line in a way that is absolutely spectacular. So I'd like to bring Roger on board now. Roger, are you here?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. You're too kind as always.
Welcome, Roger. So the Catastrophe, Stories and Lessons from the Halifax Explosion. Now, of course, Roger, you're from Halifax. You grew up there, and I think you've got a very different perspective on the Halifax Explosion than perhaps many of us do.
Yeah, it's one of the good parts of becoming old, perhaps. But as I explained to people who've asked, they said, why was so little written about the Halifax explosion until fairly recently? And I said, well, Halifax was at least a world unto itself. It's way out there on the Atlantic coast. And I always point out to people, we're a pleasant day's drive here from Boston, New York, and Washington, but it's a rather hellish 2-day run to get out to Halifax, way out there. And in Halifax, which, as I said, until really the communications revolution, after I left when I was quite young in the 60s, it's only since then that modern communications have really integrated the regions of this country more closely. And Halifax had its own culture, its own view of history. And the history is almost a family thing. And I know growing up, the explosion wasn't history. The explosion was part of every family. I had several family members who had strong memories of it. My great-grandfather came in, actually, Joe mentions it in the book. My great-grandfather was a doctor in New Glasgow, and he came in on one of the early emergency trains to do surgery. And I had various other uncles and aunts who remember being knocked off their feet and the rest of it. And so the explosion was just sort of part of family memory, not something really special that you research. And so it's been astounding in my own lifetime to see these events that I saw just sort of as local and of local interest actually come into greater prominence in recent years. Along with that, I must say, I think it's part and parcel of a general upsurge of interest in the whole First World War period that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. So you say there's not been a lot written about the Halifax explosion. I think the first real narrative that came out was The Town That Died. Is that right?
Yeah, it comes out, I think, in 1962.
So why do you think there hasn't been a lot written about the Halifax explosion when it was such a huge event?
Yeah, what's curious about it is there has and there hasn't. Right at the time, there was an Anglican priest, and matter of fact, this is very prominent in the book, Samuel Henry Prince, who was the famous St. Paul's Cathedral, St. Paul's Church in Halifax, the oldest church, Protestant church, I think, in Canada. Goes right back to I think it's built in like 1750. And he was Anglican minister there. And he was there through the explosion and very interested in social work. He helped in recovery efforts, and he wrote a very odd thesis that was then published in 1920. It takes almost a social work angle. And it's also deeply religious. There's been a lot of recent work, in part inspired by Joe Scanlon on Prince more recently. But he saw the explosion as sort of almost a religious act, like the First World War, a test of humanity. And Halifax, in getting through this test of humanity, would hopefully come forward to some sort of a new age. But that's the only substantial thing that was written until 1941, when Hugh MacLennan brought out a novel called Barometer Rising, which I've inflicted on my fourth years for the last few years. It's a very powerful novel. And again, it's family history, because Hugh MacLennan was from, he became famous as a national author when he was at McGill in Montreal, but he came from Cape Breton, and he was in Halifax during the explosion. And it's actually a very forward-looking novel. It talks about gender issues, veterans in the city and what they were going through and that sort of thing. And it's a very realistic novel, but it was the only substantial piece of writing until a British television writer. I don't know how he found out about it. I think he actually visited Halifax, Michael Bird. And in '62, he produced The Town That Died. And again, there is nothing for quite a few years. And then, interestingly enough, there's another person from away, as they say in Newfoundland, Janet Kitts, whose husband is transferred to Halifax. And I gather she had an anthropology background, and she was actually working on some of the artifacts from the explosion, got interested and wrote a wonderful book called Shattered City in the late '80s. And that's really the beginning of sustained academic interest. I think because that sort of coincided with the rise of interest in the First World War. And then I discovered in working on this project, Joe Scanlon was in fact one of the early academics to become interested. And he began to produce articles, scholarly articles on the explosion right from the late 1980s. And he participated with a Dal prof or a Dal researcher by the name of Alan Ruffman, who organized a wonderful conference. Ruffman organized a wonderful conference in Halifax in the early '90s that came out as a collection of essays, Ground Zero. But that 1994 production is actually the first sustained academic effort on the explosion, and Joe was involved. And since then, it's interesting. It's the centenary factor. I think in the upsurge of interest in the First World War, Halifax was fully caught up in that. And as you point out, we've had maybe a dozen or 15 important books come out in the last few years, which is great for this book, but in a way a bit of a shame, because many of these books cite Joe Scanlon's articles and in fact take some of his interpretive lines. Like Scanlon was not an historian. He was a journalist, and he was he was in Washington during the Kennedy years for the Toronto Star. Later gets picked up by Carleton. He's later head of the journalism program at Carleton. But he becomes interested in modern disasters. And it's by that route that he hears about Halifax and gets curious. And it's really the only historical research he ever did. And so the book is not really presented as an historical book. It's more as looking at it through the lens of a field that Joe pioneered called disaster research. And of interest in the book is he refers to 9/11 and other current disasters and drawing examples from Halifax to show how, well, I guess the central message is humans in crisis tend to do the right thing, often very courageously. And we actually, Joe is very, very witty about it. He says, when rescue parties arrive from other areas, and we saw this in 9/11, they proclaim that they have saved the day, that all was chaos till they arrived to give order. And we saw that in 9/11, but then with the more detailed stuff coming out of 9/11, you know that the people at Ground Zero were incredible. The orderly way they were evacuating the towers, even as they exploded, people giving up their lives to help friends get down these narrow staircases. The firefighters who knew they were probably doomed, who rushed in and did the right thing until the moment they died. And so Joe takes that interpretive perspective and talks about how Haligonians and Nova Scotians did the right thing very, very courageously in many cases. The pity is that he wrote the book, and I heard about it for years. You'd hear, oh, this Professor Scanlon is working on this. And one of his students came, I think you helped organize it, and gave a brilliant paper drawn from the research for the book at our conference. I later tried to contact her, but I didn't hear anything from her. And so I'd hear all this talk about the Scanlon who's done these impressive articles. He's got a whole book ready to go. And then it sort of disappeared from view until you said, "Hey, Raj, are you interested in this?" And I thought, "Oh, wow, this is so weird." Having heard about it over the past, I've been hearing about his studies. I've been hearing about them since the late '90s. And then suddenly, just a couple of years ago, you said to me, "Hey, Raj," and I'm like, "Oh, wow." Canada is such a small country.
Yeah, because Joe had pretty much finished the manuscript and then unfortunately passed away. And it kind of sat around for quite a number of years before I believe it was his son Dave that dug the manuscript out. Is that right?
Yeah, it's unusual. The manuscript, which is or the one I got, it's got bits and pieces from various versions, and you can, picking through it, you can see a final version, and it's dated 2007. And he appears to have just left it on his laptop and not done anything with it, though apparently he was passionate about the project. But Dave, his son, said that Joe was, like so many academics, a hyper and always eager about the next conference, the next paper. And so he just got consumed by other things. And he was in the full flower of life, just booming along when he was struck down in 2015. And then Dave and his siblings found the manuscript on his computer. And then the story gets really curious then, and I only became aware of it later. Again, Canada is such a small country. It turns out Dave is a retired full captain, like a colonel in the Army, from the Navy. And he was in Navy public affairs, and he did some very distinguished postings overseas with NATO. I know he got a commendation, a commendatory letter rather, from U.S. General Petraeus for his work in NATO, and I think particularly on Afghanistan. But again, small world, because I worked for many years at the Directorate of History and Heritage in Ottawa at headquarters. And it turned out I was at headquarters in Ottawa working on, I did a lot of work for public affairs just a few years before Dave showed up. So our careers had sort of intersected in that way. But after I saw the raw manuscript and said, yeah, I'd be willing to give it a go, Dave, and this is remarkable. Dave and I talked on the phone, and he said, I'll send you some stuff. And so he sent me a big Word document, and I opened it. And what it was is Dave had gone to a very good Halifax historian by the name of Barry Cahill. And he and Barry had worked over the manuscript and edited it and started working on obscure references and things like that. And David shipped it to me, and he said, I didn't really know what I was doing. I've never done an historical book, so I just give you this as a reference. And I read through it, and it was wonderful. It was absolutely top, well, as it should be. I mean,
yeah, that was my impression when I read it too.
Yeah, I mean, it was just superb. He and Barry had done the first step, and I said, Dave, this is not just a help. This is our working draft. And so I've got to give tribute, I guess, very important in the origins of the project, that it was Alan Ruffman of Dal, who I gather cheered on Joe Scanlon in all of his work. And Ruffman himself has done a number of distinguished publications. And then Barry Cahill came on board and helped Dave get the manuscript polished up. There are technical parts on the actual collision of the two ships in the harbor. We can talk a bit about that. And Joe tried to sort those out in layman's terms. And Dave got in touch with Robert Power, who is an actual pilot, Atlantic pilot working out of Halifax, and wrote a brilliant paper on the collision. It's the only paper that really makes sense of the collision. He figures out Power is this master navigator, and he figured out the angles of the sun, and he showed that as one of the ships was coming out of the harbor, the Emo, the captain probably couldn't see much because of glare off the water. He figured out all the angles of the sun. He took into account the fact that Halifax was a coal-burning economy, and there's probably he knows in what patterns the haze tends to settle on the harbor. So he figured out the visibility and all sorts of technical details. And then Power reviewed what Joe had done and gave us like a 15-page memo saying, this is good, but watch out about this. I would question this. So, many hands involved in putting it together. And then I came in and had to sort of put the historians a final touch on it. Because Barry Cahill knows Halifax history, but he hadn't done any military or naval. So that was my role, to sort of bring in the military and naval angles of it.
Yeah, I think the book, it strikes me as a really wonderful piece of literature to read. And right from the start, the first time I laid eyes on it, it was an amazing read, and the level of detail that Joe had put together, the research he had done was absolutely phenomenal. But it was raw, especially when looked at with a historian's eye. I could see there was holes in it, so it needed work. And unfortunately, with Joe's passing, he wasn't around to do that. So Roger, your contributions to it have changed it from a sort of a work in progress to really top-notch product.
I think if I'm going to sound like, oh, sorry, to sound like the dull old history prof that I am. But what nailed me between the eyes when I read it was that one of Joe's huge contributions, well, I should say, when you talk about the wonderful stories, Joe was a journalist, and he spent from the late 80s down to the early 2000s, he was manic. And he went out to all of the small towns in Nova Scotia, New Glasgow, Truro, you name it, he went there. And he went to the local city hall and said, would you have anything from, the years of the explosion? And most of the people say, oh, yeah, we've been, yeah, we sent a fire engine out. We sent our whole fire department down, and no one has ever asked us about that. And so he got old police records and fire department records out of all of these old town halls. He found a surprising number of people to talk to who either had relatives who had very vivid experience that they had passed on, and in a few cases, people who'd been very young at the time of the explosion and talked to them. So Joe pulled together all of these wonderful threads, and there's a big essay at the end, and in fact, he developed it from a published article on how he went, through Norway, graveyards in Norway, through the French Marine archives to get details on the crew members of the Mont Blanc munition ship that exploded. It's simply an incredible story. But one of the things he did is he must have spent months at our National Archives, Library and Archives Canada, and he was the very first to dig out a mass of files. Well, by mass of files, I say it's probably about 8 boxes worth of files of Army records on the explosion. And the big story for me, and be warned, I've been in love with the story of the Army in Halifax from the time I was a kid. I wrote and watched the troops when I was 8 and 9 years old, and all that sort of stuff. But what he shows is when you talk about the locals dealing right away within an hour or less with the situation, the biggest reason Halifax was able to do that was because of the Army. It had a very large garrison there. It was a very important defended port. And so Joe has all of these richnesses on what the Army did, but he had no idea about why the Army was there or what it was doing. And my own work had been to discover that the British Army had a strong presence in Halifax to defend the naval dockyard right from the middle 18th century when Halifax was founded. And that Halifax was such an important strategic position. When the Royal Navy closed the dockyard in 1904 and left, the Royal Navy said the British Army still had to maintain a garrison at Halifax in case of an international emergency, because the Royal Navy would need secure port on the Western North Atlantic. I mean, that's the key to Britain's survival, is North Atlantic merchant trade. And the British Army was running into financial trouble, and they asked Ottawa if Ottawa would help. And in a fluky thing, Wilfrid Laurier, our namesake, who would never do anything for defense, he more than doubled the defense budget and tripled the size of our tiny regular army from 1,000 to 3,000 troops, and put a full professional Canadian garrison, and also made arrangements to bring back a lot of the experienced British garrison people. And so it's really the birth of the modern Canadian Army in Halifax. They have a full garrison from 1906 with a lot of British experts there. They do extensive training and planning. And when war breaks out in 1914, everybody says Canada wasn't prepared. Well, Halifax, it was just like there was a 100-page document on how you mobilize for certain war conditions. So they had the whole scenario there. Off they go. They bring in about 3,000 militia troops. And the regulars are ultimately the main regular regiment is sent overseas, the Royal Canadian Regiment. And so the Army garrison is very well set up, and they've got a very strong command center under Major General Thomas Benson, who is one of the few professional generals in the Canadian Army. And he had been organizing the whole of the mobilization of the Maritime region, for the Canadian Expeditionary Force and everything else. All through the war. So you had this crackerjack garrison, which at the time of the explosion, it had 3,000 militia troops on full-time service. And about a quarter of them actually were still Canadian regulars. And there was 1,700 British and Canadian Expeditionary Force troops in town undergoing training and awaiting transport overseas. So this is why the Army is in a position to do a great deal. And the Army really does heroic things. And it's through the Army that the three Royal Navy warships in port, they have a total of about 1,000 crew who do wonderful things, but they coordinate through the Canadian Army. And the U.S. Navy, well, the U.S. Coast Guard has a small cutter there, and the U.S. Navy has a lightly manned crewed ship there. But then two large U.S. cruisers come roaring in. They actually see the explosion over the horizon. They come in that same day, and they put hundreds of troops, of sailors ashore. But all of this effort is coordinated by General Benson and by his superb command headquarters, which has been running the whole war effort for the whole eastern part of the country for some years. So it's no wonder that they had their act together. That's right. That's probably more than you want to know about the Army. But Joe had none of that context. So he would mention, the Army's all the way through it, but he had never appreciated what a well-organized garrison it was and how many different departments there were that did different things. Huge medical department, big supplies department. They had everything there. And as Joe shows, they literally opened the depots and the warehouses and just poured stuff out. Anybody who needed anything, they got it. The hospitals were in trouble, so it was the military kitchens that began to run, believe it or not, a full meal service for all of the hospitals in the city. But they were able to do this because they had, huge capacity, because they were moving a lot of troops through, and they were used to doing this. And this in turn explains another thing. Joe's other big discovery, and it's wonderful stuff, is he calls it the magnificent railways. And it's because although the railway yard in the North End was wiped out in the explosion, very shortly the railway gets back into operation. And Joe was, I think, the first to document in detail how the railway is the key to early outside help. And it operates at a number of levels. The railways there are actually two railway systems that come into Halifax, what's now CP, and used to be Dominion Atlantic Railway, and the other used to be the Intercolonial Railway. It's now Canadian National. And they both had their own telegraph systems. And so although the telegraph systems right around the city were blown out, the full railway system is going, and people quickly know, hey, there's something happening. So the word gets out on the telegraph, and within an hour, all of the towns on the rail line, as I said, the Glasgow, Truro, and many others, are sending help into Halifax. And even more important, the railways, and Joe didn't quite put this together, but the railways have now for 3 years been working hand in glove with the armed forces and the munitions industry, shipping masses of stuff down to Halifax. So the railways are used to working with the Army Transport Service. And so within hours of the explosion, the Army is getting guys from their own hospitals who are ambulatory, who can walk. They're getting them on the trains and getting them out to Truro and Glasgow, both set up emergency hospitals to look after these people. And also some of the badly injured are very quickly evacuated by rail. So these are Joe's huge discoveries on how the city did so well initially. But in order to understand that, you need to understand that Halifax was founded and developed all through the late 18th and 19th and early 20th century as a strategic British port. It is truly the imperial port. It's like a little corner of England in many, many ways. Sorry, now you're not only a boring historian, but a proud ex-Haligonian. So.
No, there's nothing boring about that at all. I just saw on the news a couple days ago that Halifax has sent the big Christmas tree down to Boston, and something they've done ever since the explosion to acknowledge the support and help they received from the American states, New England and Massachusetts and everything like that. But I think what Joe has shown is that even before the outside help came in, there was a lot of good stuff being done on the ground by the Haligonians who were there, and the Blue Nosers who were just outside coming back to help out.
Yeah, matter of fact, Joe, the experienced pressman, he's absolutely fascinating on this. And what he points out is that, in fact, and he actually got the documents out of the Army records, and that is by the time the Boston, the whole of New England explodes with help. They are incredible. And they ship in doctors and nurses, the National Guard units, as a matter of fact, in all of the states, Rhode Island, Maine, and Massachusetts, they just pile in everything they can onto trains. The problem is that there's a horrific blizzard right after the explosion, and the rail system, long distance rail, sort of falls apart. So the big help from the States can't get in until 48 hours afterwards. And Joe documents from the Army files that the Army command is saying, is now begging everybody not to come. They said the Army staff is being overwhelmed by too much material in too many city. But that said, and a lot of the doctors who come up from the States, they only need to stay for a few days because the Nova Scotia doctors and the military doctors have everything under control. But the American nurses are an absolute treasure, and there are hundreds of them. And Lieutenant Colonel McKelvey Bell, who is the chief medical officer in the Halifax garrison, who coordinates all of this, and Joe celebrates him. He said, it's like he had read the modern manuals on disaster. And as a matter of fact, I dug into McKelvey Bell's life. Sorry for a digression. My students make fun of me, but saying, don't let them get off on a tangent. Or some of them say sometimes the tangents are much better than the main story. But McKelvey Bell, it turns out, was an Ottawa surgeon, and he was an old militia guy. And he mobilizes in September of 1914, and he goes overseas and he helps set up one of the early field hospitals in France in 1915, 1916. I want to do more work on this because he's then brought back to Ottawa to be the deputy director of all medical services in Ottawa. So the guy must be hot. Then the next part of the story is really intriguing, and that is there's a scandal I wasn't even aware of in 1916 about wounded troops coming back from the UK and not being properly cared for by the government. Big scandal, and the result of that was the establishment, essentially what now is Veterans Affairs. And one of the earliest moves is to put in 2 new big military hospitals in Halifax just to receive the wounded coming back from overseas. And McKelvey Bell, just as this happens, McKelvey Bell is sent to Nova Scotia. I think there's no coincidence at all. This guy is really, really good. So he arrives in Halifax and stands up these 2 big new hospitals, but he's highly experienced. I mean, he's helped run an overseas hospital. He's helped straighten out all medical services in Ottawa. And now he is standing up the whole system for returning convalescents from Europe. I mean, this guy is just, he is super, and Joe praises him to the sky. Matter of fact, at the end of his report, McKelvey Bell says, here are I think the 6 of the 8 lessons we learned. And Joe said you could take that page from his report, which is still buried in the Army archives in Ottawa, and you could put it in a modern manual on how to respond to a disaster. And Joe was, I think, one of the first to recognize the genius of McKelvey Bell. The guy was truly, truly remarkable.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what would you tell readers who know something about the Halifax explosion? Is there a reason to buy Joe's book?
I think, he is the first to make detailed use of the Army materials and to fit it into the bigger story. He did absolutely amazing research on the railways. He's got he's got some of the big railway figures there. He has a lovely way of describing people and personalities. And so the railway is new. And as a journalist, he had a take on, before I got off on McKelvey Bell, he has a take on how the events were reported at the time. And what he points out is that as I mentioned, the trains, the relief trains coming in from New England were delayed for 48 hours or 72 hours. And he said on board those trains were all sorts of journalists who wanted to get the big story. So as the trains are coming up, the journalists are reporting to the big US papers about what's going on and what they're hearing about what's going on in Halifax, but especially about the heroic preparations among the American rescue teams. In the meantime, in the first hours of the explosion, when communications are cut off, there's only one local report that gets out, and it's a blockbuster. I mean, it's a wonderful report. But the author is just in one part of Halifax, and he doesn't have the big picture of what's going on. And so Joe says that really the story of what happened in Halifax, what really gets out is the stuff that comes out through the big American papers. And so it tends to, now Joe says the Americans are absolutely wonderful. He has no problem with that at all. He says the generosity was amazing, but their publicity machine was very, very good. And the Canadian publicity machine was virtually non-existent. And so the story started right at the time and has continued to this day that Halifax was saved by New England. And I was going to add, as an old Nova Scotian, the New England-Nova Scotia tie is incredibly close. I mean, Nova Scotia is essentially founded through Massachusetts, and the family ties are remarkable. Even in my family, it's among my great uncles. I think I have 6 great uncles. 2 of them went off to what were called the Boston States to make it good, and never came home. And that is so typical. Rob Fisher of the National Archives did a wonderful article on this, and the out-migration from the Maritimes since the mid-19th century has been fairly remarkable, and a large proportion of it went down to Massachusetts and Maine and Rhode Island. You know, those are the most. Matter of fact, when my dad retired and had to go to a more southerly climb because of his health, he picked Massachusetts because he said it felt just like Canada but with a better climate. He just loved it there. And he said, you know, the people, the culture. He said it was like being back in Nova Scotia, but without the frightful winters.
Oh, that's great. So this book was completed under challenging circumstances, as we're all faced with COVID and being locked away from a lot of the things we want to do and places we want to go. How do you go about finishing a book when you can't go to the archives and you can't get out to do the things you might normally do to finish off a book?
Yeah, unfortunately, much as I loathe electronic technology, it's because of electronic technology. Okay, here's confessions of a professional historian. As I got into the book, I'd have more and more questions, and you know where this is heading. I wanted everything from Library and Archives Canada. And Serge Derflinger, an old colleague of mine, recommended an outstanding PhD student of his, Melissa Davidson. And she went in and photographed about 6,000 pages for me. And everything I could think of. Actually, I think it was more than that. It was probably about 8,000 pages in the end. But the fluke is, I got the last files she did for me, I think, 3 weeks before the lockdown when the archives closed. Talk about luck. So Melissa was incredible, and the power of digital photography is just amazing. But when we plunged on and we discovered that in other areas, not on government records, that there were things we couldn't figure out, I discovered that the Nova Scotia Archives has put online all of the notes and first drafts of the explosion's official historian. One of the reasons the city responded so effectively is the city council was wonderfully professional. Within an hour of the explosion, they are assembling and they are setting up emergency committees to help the fire service for medical relief, food supplies and everything like that. And General Benson is there, and he integrates the Army staff right into the city committees. But interestingly, they recognize the importance of history, and they designated Del Prof, Archibald McMeekin, as the official historian, and he's interviewing people, and he kept all of his notes, and the Nova Scotia Archives has done a fantastic job preserving it. But then later, when the Halifax Relief is taken over by a federal agency, the Permanent Halifax Relief Commission, they say they have no money to publish any official histories. So you and I were talking the other day. You said, Roger, I've got this neat book from the 70s on the Halifax Explosion. I said, Mike, that's a gem. That's a local Nova Scotia project to finally publish in 1978 the official history, which was assembled by Archibald McMeekin. But the Nova Scotia Archives put all of his notes and drafts online. And oh my God, what a godsend. And then I discovered, even more remarkable, the Nova Scotia government has put online a register of all of those known to have died in the Halifax explosion. But there are columns that indicate the source of the report of the death. So this is pure gold. And then online newspapers, so things went pretty well. But then I was telling you, later on in the editorial process, we discovered that there's so many personal names in the stories of people who Joe saw or heard about their families. And so many of the family names in Nova Scotia are similar that there was confusion. It was obviously he had mistranscribed, and sometimes we thought he was talking about 3 different people, but when we looked at it, we said, oh my Lord, it's probably all the same guy. And so one godsend was having Barry Cahill, who does actually the history of relief in Halifax. He had a lot of his own material, and he had a good hook into the Nova Scotia archives. And then I finally, in desperation, I got ancestry.ca. And I don't know how we're doing for time, but I have a funny story about that. If you think we
go ahead, please.
It's a real historian story. There was a section on the churches, and there was a bunch of quotes that Joe got on tragedies of the churches. And he had a quote, and it wasn't clear where it had come from. And in the quote, there is what is obviously the minister of a destroyed church reporting. And he said, Mrs. Tompkinson is injured but recovering. And then he said, young Constance is slightly cut. The baby is okay. It's a great quote, and we wanted to use it, but it's not clear who is speaking. It's in with a bunch of other material on churches that had trouble. And so Barry, Dave, and I, via email, Barry, Dave, and I working like brothers, sometimes 12, 14 hours a day together on this. And I've never physically met these guys, which is a sign of the new age. I had to look up their pictures on the web to find out who I was talking to, which is a screen. But the 3 of us put our heads together, and we figured if this preacher is referring to Mrs. Tompkinson, maybe that's his wife. And so maybe the preacher's name is Tompkinson. And so we dug around, ultimately on ancestry.com, and discovered, yes, in Halifax, one of the Methodist churches was run by an ex-Brit by the name of Harold Tompkinson. And we dug further, and we discovered, yes, he had his wife, Grace, and he had a young daughter born in 1915 by the name of Constance, so that fit. And yes, the family had a baby, Joan, who was born in September 1917. So we had it nailed. But then in Ancestry, people can build their family trees and add material. And fantastic stuff came out. Reverend Harold Tompkinson was, it seems, a bit of a free-thinking character. And he ran a very modern family. And his wife, Grace, it turns out his wife is Grace Avard Tompkinson, who was a noted novelist. And she wrote a number of novels, and we discovered all sorts of references to her in English, in Canadian English literary history. The daughter, young Constance, born in 1915, she later went to New York and became a chorus girl in Broadway and off-Broadway shows, and then wrote a series of books, The Real Life of a Showgirl, semi-scandalous books in the 50s. And Maclean's actually ran a feature on her as sort of one of these young, they called it beatnik then, one of these free-thinking young women who, go into dangerous professions. And, oh, she's a preacher's daughter. Isn't that remarkable? But Constance wrote a number of best-selling books on the life of showgirls. She had several marriages and wound up in the UK as Lady Hugh Weeks. Sir Hugh Weeks being a noted British economist. And the little baby who escaped injury, it turns out Joan was her name. She was born in September 1917. That fits. She later went to Mount Allison. And then towards the end of the Second World War, she joined the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Administration, and did rescue work among European refugees in Europe for 3 years. then came back to New York City, joined a Wall Street firm, and became one of the first prominent women stockbrokers on Wall Street. And so all of this came out of this chance little bit of quote. Mrs. Tompkinson is cut about the head. Young Constance has some cuts, but we'll be okay. The baby is fine. That's all we had. And this is an incredible story that came out. Fortunately, we didn't have the room. Dave, bless him, when I was stressing out on other things, Dave reworked the paragraph to say, both the wife and the daughters are fascinating people and you should know more. So it's just an example of how the team worked together.
So right there, for everybody out there watching, you've just received a master class in how a professional historian can take a tiny little bit of information and go dig and research and explore and find a whole cornucopia of information that puts life into characters that really had no life except for a brief little mention. So that's pretty remarkable. We're lucky enough to have Dave Scanlon in the audience with us today watching, and he's just written in a comment, and I'll read that out. He says, one of the unique aspects of the book, I think, is that Joe Scanlon writes about the explosion through the eyes of a journalist. He writes also about it through the eyes of a sociologist and an international disaster scholar. Thus, he draws out important lessons learned about disaster response, including similarities with later experience, like 9/11, like Roger was talking about. So yeah, absolutely. That was what really struck me when I first read the manuscript, was that Joe wasn't a professional historian. He was a journalist with a very different background than most people who've been writing about the Halifax explosion. And he's really brought his unique eye, his unique experience, his unique education, and put a lens on the Halifax explosion that tells us a lot that we didn't know before. We also have some more questions, and this one is a great one. We don't just have a local audience or a national audience, we have an international audience that's spanning continents. And this question comes from Brian Farrell, an old friend of mine who is in Singapore. And he says, hello from a sunny morning in Singapore. Delighted to see this happen. I met Dave, that's Dave Scanlon, in 1981 at Carleton, and we've been good friends ever since. And also through him, I met Joe, and I enjoyed his company very much over the years and his support for my own academic career as it unfolded. We spoke about this book a number of times over the years, and I think the last time was on one of my visits home in 2010. At the time, he was quite fired up, as always, about a lead he was following regarding the types of explosives and where they were stored on board the Mont Blanc. He thought there was something new there, and Brian asks, did anything ever come of that?
Yes, by an odd route. Yeah, Joe did get some good leads. And then it turns out that what Joe had found, Alan Ruffman had done a piece which had gathered everything known. And then we had another look at the transcript of the inquiry. And one of the stories that's persisted that was loaded on the deck of the ship were barrels of a liquid, and it was benzol. And the lead Joe is chasing down is he thought it was benzol, as in it's a hydrocarbon, and it's virtually like high test gasoline. It comes from coal tar, but it's like a component in high test aviation gasoline. So he thought, Lord, they've got like aviation gasoline on the deck in these drums. That's just like the putting a fuse on the rest of the cargo. And digging through the inquiry transcript, there's a part that was never published. In Ottawa, they still have the original typescript that was made right at the time. And they had up a Mr. Copes, who was an explosives expert from DuPont Explosives in the States. And they went after him on various things. And he argued that the benzol was probably not the gasoline. It was actually a further refined product called monochloral benzol. Sorry with that. And it was actually more highly refined, and it was used as a component in explosives, but it was not nearly as unstable as straight benzol. And Mr. Cope suggested that it was listed as benzol on the ship register, just as a short form. And Joe had questions about that, but it turns out when we found the actual testimony from the explosives expert, and then we matched it up with Alan Ruffman's work in the archives, yes, what was in the drums on the deck was monochloral benzol, which was a component of explosives, but not nearly as flammable as gasoline. And so the U.S. Explosives experts from DuPont was right that those barrels were not an untoward hazard, a virtual breaking of all safety regulations and putting them on the deck. But what Joe did dig out was that what filled the main part of the cargo was called picric acid. And following Joe's leads, turns out picric acid was sort of the basic component of what the British called lyddite, which was apparently one of the most common high explosives. Now, I don't know chemistry and I don't know World War I explosives, but it was picric acid, which was sort of the basic component in the standard Western Allied explosives of the First World War. And they had what I think something like 2 kilotons of picric acid in various forms. And then they had gun cotton, you name it. And then they had straight modern TNT, talk about a floating bomb. But Joe really opened up that question. And there's a couple of extended footnotes where we followed up his leads. And perhaps it's another reason to have a look at the book.
Wonderful. We have another question here. We're going to wind this up soon, but if anybody has questions, please type them into the Q&A point, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before we're done here. Jeff Keelan, another old friend of ours who used to work at WLU Press and did his PhD at Laurier, says, what was the reaction in the aftermath of the explosion? Were Haligonians angry at authorities for the explosion? How long until they knew it was an accident and not something else like sabotage?
Yeah, that's extremely perceptive. And Haligonians were enraged. And initially, as in the fire that destroyed the Parliament buildings in Ottawa in 1916, there were many reports from people who claimed to have seen German dirigibles flying over, that it was a German bombing attack. But the remarkable thing is, from the very, very first news reports that come out, it's clearly identified as an accident. And the blame, the locals tend to blame the Mont Blanc, the ship carrying the munitions, because when Mont Blanc gets rammed by Emo and then catches fire, Mont Blanc's people, and it's from the explosion from the collision to the explosion is about 19 minutes, which is the tragedy. That gives time for people to gather around the harbor to see this burning ship. But the French crew knows that there isn't any hope. And so they abandon ship immediately, and they're screaming to everybody they can, to take cover. But of course, they're mostly yelling in French, and so people don't pick up on it. But it looks like, and Joe really got the Nova Scotia culture on this. Nova Scotia it's odd to say because Nova Scotia has such strong French Acadian heritage, but Nova Scotians tended to be quite anti-Quebec because of Quebec's opposition to conscription. This is at the height of the conscription crisis. And so there is a propensity because the crew of the Mont Blanc survived, sauve qui peut. This is a typical French attitude. So they tended to blame it on the Mont Blanc. And the local pilot, Francis Mackey, he also survived. He endures hell. Under local pressure, the police arrest him and put him under a murder charge. Also, the locals blame the Navy. They hate the Canadian Navy. I could give a whole hour on this. The Canadian Navy barely existed in 1914 because after it was founded in 1910, the Borden government gets elected in 1911 and sees the Navy as rampant corrupt nationalism by the Laurier liberals. And so Borden stops development of the Navy. The Navy barely exists in 1914. And it's very, very ill prepared for the war. So it has a long struggle to keep up with its growing responsibilities. And the locals in Halifax tend to regard the Canadian Navy as a joke. I mean, they've had the Royal Navy all through their lives. And so they tend to have high regard for the Royal Navy. And so the locals also launch a hate campaign against Frederick Evans Wyatt, who is actually a British officer seconded to the Royal Navy to do traffic control in the port. And he's also brought up on a murder charge. And thank God that the higher level courts immediately throw these charges out and says there's no substance at all. But those two men suffered long-term damage. Wyatt ultimately leaves the country. There's a couple of other, after the explosion, everybody's watching the harbor like hawks. And there are a couple of cases where I think in one case a tanker is allowed to come in while another ship is leaving. And there's another similar incident, and the Navy just fires Wyatt over that, and he leaves the country. Though it's pretty clear he didn't have the administrative resources at his hands. I mean, he just didn't have what he needed to do the job. And he pointed that out in the testimony before the inquiries. And the government lawyer, who was a local who had helped recover injured, attacks him all the time and says, "Oh, so you're blaming everybody else, this tragedy. You're not taking responsibility." Harangues the guy in the supposedly neutral inquiry. It's really embarrassing to read. It's awful stuff. John, I recommend another book, John Armstrong's book on the Royal Canadian Navy and the Halifax Explosion. Gives a lot of detail about this horror story. So that bitterness persists. What is interesting is that the government in Ottawa does not want to raise the question of blame at all, because all of the shipping is actually ultimately under Royal Navy control. And Mont Blanc is a French ship under Royal Navy control who is loaded by American longshoremen in New York. And you can see between the lines in Robert Borden's correspondence and some of the Department of Marine correspondence, no one wants to raise the issue of responsibility. So the government soft pedals that. And in fact, the Admiralty immediately recognizes, the Royal Navy recognizes what the score is. And the Brits send over wonderful messages. The King, everybody sends over messages of condolence. And the British government supplies a huge amount, some tens of thousands of pounds, the equivalent of many millions of dollars today. And the federal government, in fact, sets up this permanent Halifax Relief Commission to provide pensions, drawing, in fact, in part on the generous gifts that come in from around the world, especially the British government, and sets up the Halifax Relief Commission, which continues until the 1970s, and supervises reconstruction, gives out pensions and the rest of it. But one of the reasons I think, though no one says that out loud, the Canadian government is so generous, is they do not want to raise the issue of responsibility. So for the locals, for about 5 years, there's a hate on for poor Francis Mackey, the pilot, and for poor Wyatt, the ex-Royal Navy officer. And after, my impression is, after that, the bitterness does tend to die down. So that vehemence, that blame game does not, I think, persist long term. And certainly you don't see it in Hugh McLennan's novel in 1941.
Well, that's fantastic. It's interesting how they went through the different phases of grief.
Yeah, that's very much what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll wrap things up. Jeffrey Street has a really interesting question on process. He says, congratulations on finishing the project. I know it's been a long haul. I'd like to hear your thoughts about balancing your voice with Scanlon's. It was his manuscript, but did you get a lot? To get it to a polished, publishable state? How much of it is you, and how much of it is Joe?
Yeah, it's here I'll have to share the blame. Because Barry Cahill and Dave was represents the estate and had to approve everything. But when I realized he was a professional editor with a D&D background like mine, I brought him in as my co-editor, and I passed everything by him. And Dave was great. I mean, having done press releases and things like that, he would rework wording. So I said in the introduction, I mean, all of it is in Joe's voice, and we didn't change the thrust or the storyline. I did a rough count, and I had my say in the author's introduction. Dave and I, especially, I guess, we probably reworked about 20% of the manuscript, substantively, reworking sentences to clarify them, adding a phrase with additional information, that sort of thing. So that's maybe 20% of the manuscript. But Joe was such a professional writer, we could fit that right in. And so we weren't changing his voice substantially. So I say this is still very, very much, very, very much his book. And I guess if we really want to get into the inners of working is, in a sense, Joe could have been here with us and we would have done the same thing. And this is why I loved having Dave as my partner, because he kept giving me reassurance. He said, no, my dad would like this. The way Dave and I worked with the material, and Barry as well worked with the material, is the way any editor would work with a living author. And so when I say, there's maybe 20% where we rearranged wording or removed a weak paragraph and put in a better researched one, I can say I've been involved, I think, in about 30 book projects. This happens in every book project. So it's, and I bet you if Joe was around, well, Dave has reassured me, he said if his dad was still alive, he'd be cheering us on.
Yeah, as a journalist, I'm sure he's used to being dealing with revisions and people reworking stuff, and it has ended up in a stronger product at the end. So I see we're at 8 o'clock now, so it's time to draw things to a close. Raj, do you have any final thoughts you want to share before we wind this down?
Just say that it's very, very difficult to get something like this published, and if it wasn't for your interest, Mike, and then for the wholehearted support of the Laurier Press, I am certain this never would have come out. And so I am extremely impressed and grateful that the press has brought this out. And I say this with some feeling. My father was a writer and a bit of a journalist, and he had a terrible time with academic presses. And to now, having held his hand through some of his frustrations, now to see the wonderful support we've had from the Laurier Press. I'm sorry, it's probably a little too personal, but I've found it inspirational from start to finish, which is why I took the job on, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, and of course this is...
We're certainly very happy that you did.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, I was going to say this is Roger's second book with Laurier Press. He did Loyal Gunners with Lee Windsor and Mark Milner, and that experience didn't scare him away, but brought him back. So I guess that's a vote of confidence.
We'll take it. We'll take it. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Roger, very much. This has just been a fascinating discussion, and I hope that it has inspired all of our international audience, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Inspired you to read the book. I'll remind everyone that there are links in the chat to purchase in ebook format or print format, whatever format you prefer to read in, we have available. And to say good evening, everyone. Stay safe, take good care.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning to you, Brian.
Thanks, Mike. That was just wonderful.